Welcome back. Take two. First one didn't work. We're going to try this again. We're in Matthew chapter 7 today. As I was reading the chapter, I was thinking back to my childhood and specifically to Sunday school. We used to sing a few songs in the little Baptist church I grew up in right before we went to the Sunday school hour. And I remember my aunt playing when I was growing up. And one of the songs that we used to sing at the time was The Wise Man Built His House. Of course, I'm sure many of you know that song or remember it, singing it when you were growing up. But it communicates some of the truths here from the end of Matthew chapter 7, if you've read that chapter today. I thought it was a fun song at the time. Of course, it's built, or it communicates rather, some very serious truths that Jesus talks about here. At the end of the chapter, it's the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has been preaching that since Matthew chapter 5. Probably over the course of a couple of days, this has taken place. And while we may have reduced it in some sense to a children's song, there are some very we don't want to underestimate the message that's being communicated here in that song and here in Matthew chapter 7. When I was growing up, our house was on a hill. In fact, we had a creek in front of us and behind us, or a creek, depending on where you're growing up, where you grew up. Both of those were connected to the Mississippi River, though, and in any large rainstorm, oftentimes it would overflow the banks, and then we'd be trapped, if you will. Behind us and in front of us, off to the side, there was water everywhere. And occasionally we left ahead of time and we spent the day at my grandparents' house, but most of the time we were trapped for maybe a day or so. It wasn't real long, but I remember those times, especially as we're coming here to Matthew chapter 7. Jesus uses things that are familiar with the people to communicate truth and to talk to them. The torrential downpours, if you will, were common in Israel at the time. There still are yet today. And Jesus uses this to talk to the people and to communicate some serious truth to them at this time. The wise man, which is a theme throughout Matthew's gospel, is the person who built his house on the secure rock, which would protect that house from the flood surges that would come as a result of these rains. He is the person, in Jesus' words here, as Jesus is trying to say, that not only just hears Jesus, but also obeys, puts into practice the things that Jesus is talking about. In contrast to that, the foolish person, now this is not one who's foolish mentally or intellectually, but spiritually and morally. This person has built his house on the sand, so to speak, as the passage says, which is talking about the fact that he has heard the words of Jesus, but he doesn't do anything about them. And these rains then are testing, or even God's judgment, which reveal the true nature of that individual at the time. Now, this reminds us a lot of James chapter 1, verse 22, which says this, but be sure you live out the message and do not merely listen to it and so deceive yourselves. Listening and hearing, or listening or hearing and obedience are meant to couple one another, to be together. We're supposed to respond to the message. Now here at the time, culturally, in this historical context, the people that Jesus is speaking to are trusting in other things. Their confidence is in their heritage, their deeds as well, that the religious leaders have prescribed, and that those things are going to earn their way to heaven. And through these 3 chapters, though, Jesus speaks about the necessity, speaks about the importance of heartfelt obedience. And this is a theme not just here in Matthew, but throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. God desires heartfelt obedience, people who obey His commands out of their love for Him. Jesus isn't concerned about their heritage. He's not concerned about which synagogue they attend. He's not concerned about how faithfully they kept to the letter of the law. He's concerned about heartfelt obedience, because obedience can just be strictly exterior and have no interior, no heartfelt connection. Now, salvation, or the way to heaven, has always been by faith. Paul makes that clear in Ephesians 2, and he talks about the Old Testament as well in Romans chapter 4, that from cover to cover, salvation has always been by faith. Beyond this, though, and in company with this, God has always encouraged heartfelt obedience. People are to, we think of Matthew chapter 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Part of that is in our love for God is obeying Him. That's how we see that. That's how that's outworked. Now, obedience is not slavery. I know we live in a world today that would say it is. Satan lies to us as well and tells us that obedience is slavery. But in fact, obedience to God brings life and freedom. Think of it this way. When I tell the truth, I don't have to worry about the lie that I've just told. I don't have to worry about who I told what story. Mentally, I'm free. Spiritually, I'm free before God as well in that case. I'm innocent before Him. When I'm faithful in my marriage, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, that relationship grows. The intimacy deepens as God meant it to. And in the process, it reflects the intimacy of the Godhead as well, just as God designed it. When I obey my parents, life usually goes well in that respect, in my relationship with them. Disobedience, of course, leads to disaster, leads to complications and problems. Yesterday, we know, of course, was Resurrection Day, and the resurrection was sealed the deal, if you will, and as such, it calls us to a new way of life. It reminds us that we have freedom in Christ to respond in obedience. We're no longer slaves to sin, and it calls us to life as it was meant to be originally. Now, life here's not always going to be easy. We understand that. You know that, I know that. But in times of testing and trials and ultimately judgment, it's going to be clear who is merely hearing and who has heard, believed, and then acted upon those things. Who has built their house on the sand versus built their house on the rock of Jesus Christ. The question then becomes, who will we prove to be on that day? What kind of person are we? Are we the wise person or the foolish person? Hope these words have challenged and encouraged you today as you've read Matthew 7 or as you read it here, perhaps this evening or tomorrow. Until next time, God bless.